She first saw it in the margins of a classroom ledger, not in a forbidden book, not in a political pamphlet, but beside the ordinary names children were told to admire. The same families kept appearing after ruined estates changed hands, after railways were granted corridors, after banks absorbed debts nobody else could survive. By 1901, she had turned the pattern into a lesson, not an accusation, a sequence. Dates, charters, inheritances, transfers. Her students understood it faster than the school board expected. Then the lesson was removed, and she was told where history was no longer allowed to begin. The first time the children noticed the pattern, it was not because she told them what to see. She had written nothing inflammatory on the board. No accusations, no names circled in anger, no claim that any one family had stolen what another family lost. The lesson was supposed to be ordinary civics. The rise of modern industry, the disciplines of enterprise, the families whose donations had given the city, libraries, hospital wings, museums, scholarships, and schools like the one in which they were sitting. That was the approved version. The schoolroom stood on the second floor of a brick municipal building, above a tax office and across from a bank whose directors' names appeared often enough in local notices that even the older children recognized them. The teacher was 56, widowed, precise in dress and handwriting, known less for severity than for a habit of making students check dates twice. She had spent 30 years teaching history from books selected by committees, and for most of those years she had accepted the order of those books without imagining that the order itself was part of the lesson. Then, in the winter of 1901, while preparing a unit on civic benefactors, she began copying family names from the textbook into a ledger. Beside each name she placed the date given for the fortune's beginning, the first bank charter, the first railway contract, the first refinery share, the first real estate trust, the first university endowment. It was a teacher's exercise, no more suspicious than arranging spelling words into columns. But columns have a way of revealing what sentences hide. The names did not spread evenly across the century. They gathered. They gathered after panics, after fires, after war contracts, after municipal debts were reorganized, after rail corridors were granted through districts whose older owners had disappeared from the record. Families described in the textbook as builders seemed, in the documents, to appear most clearly after someone else's title became uncertain, after a courthouse archive burned, after a bank failed, after an estate passed through trustees no child had ever been taught to name. She did not call this theft. She did not need to. What disturbed her was the timing. The official version loved the middle of the story. The mill, the railroad, the bank, the office, the donation, the portrait in the trustee's room. It moved quickly past the beginning, as though beginnings were messy but unimportant. Yet when she followed the first entries backward, the beginnings were not vague at all. They were recorded in deeds, probate summaries, tax abatements, foreclosure notices, incorporation papers, maps with old parcels erased and new blocks drawn over them in cleaner lines. The children saw it because children are less trained than adults to forgive a missing step. On the first day, she asked them to compare 3 approved biographies with 3 public notices reproduced from the county files. She expected confusion. Instead, one boy raised his hand and asked why the same surname appeared on the creditor list and later on the hospital plaque. A girl near the window asked why the family that endowed the scholarship had bought land the year after the old ward burned. Another student, whose father worked at the rail yard, noticed that a railway grant and a bank merger shared 2 trustees. The room changed after that. It was not excitement, exactly. It was the stillness that enters a room when a pattern has been seen and cannot be unseen. The teacher moved to correct them, then stopped, because the correction available in the textbook did not answer the question the records had opened. Enterprise explained industry after possession. It did not explain possession itself. By Friday, she had built a larger chart, not to expose, not to accuse, but to organize the problem, honestly. Across the top, she placed the familiar categories: banks, railways, land companies, schools, museums, foundations, newspapers. Down the left side, she listed years of disruption: closures, fires, bankruptcies, public works acts, military contracts, estate settlements, tax sales. Where the lines met, names appeared with a regularity that made coincidence feel less like caution and more like obedience. She taught the chart in a low voice. She reminded them that records were not motives, that timing was not confession, that inheritance could be legal and still require a history. But the restraint only made the lesson stronger. The children were not being asked to believe. They were being asked to arrange facts in order. The order was beginning to speak. That was the moment the lesson became dangerous. The official story had a rhythm so smooth that no one noticed where it began. A poor boy learns discipline. A young clerk sees opportunity. A merchant risks everything. A banker believes in the future. A railroad man joins two distant markets and is rewarded by history. The biographies varied in costume and location, but not in moral shape. They turned accumulation into character, and character into proof that the accumulation had been deserved from the beginning. Her chart did not disprove industry. That was never the point. Mills had been built. Rails had been laid. Banks had extended credit. Men had worked, speculated, negotiated, failed, tried again, and sometimes succeeded. But when she traced the public record, not the commemorative version, but the deeds, charters, trustee appointments, receivership notices, and debt schedules, a different layer appeared underneath the familiar one. The fortunes were not created from nothing. They were positioned. They appeared where older claims had weakened, where public need had been converted into private concession, where emergency legislation had opened corridors that ordinary law would have kept closed. Land moved after fire. Credit moved after panic. Contracts moved during war. Rail access moved after municipal debt. School lands, church lands, estate lands, and abandoned war properties passed through committees with names too dull to survive in any patriotic textbook. Then emerged, years later, inside foundations whose generosity would be praised by children seated under portraits of the same families. Again, she was careful. She did not say every fortune followed the same path. She did not say talent played no part. She did not say illegality where the documents showed procedure. What she said, in the exact language of a teacher protecting both truth and employment, was that legality does not erase sequence, and sequence is part of history. That sentence was repeated outside the classroom before the week was over. The first complaint did not mention facts. That mattered. It came through the headmaster, folded inside the courteous language by which institutions make fear sound administrative. Certain parents were concerned that the lesson placed undue emphasis on class antagonism. A trustee wondered whether immature students could properly interpret financial documents. Another member of the school board wrote that the school's purpose was to cultivate civic gratitude, not distrust toward benefactors whose public spirit had materially advanced the city. No one identified an error. No one produced a corrected date, a competing deed, a different sequence of ownership. No one said the bank charter did not follow the panic, or the rail grant did not follow the tax sale, or the museum endowment did not come from the same trust that had acquired 3 burned blocks for almost nothing. The objection was not factual. It was tonal. The lesson made the approved story feel different after it was heard. That is the beginning of censorship in its most durable form. Not the burning of books, not the dramatic arrest of a dissident teacher. A request for balance, a concern about impression, a reminder that children require uplift, a suggestion that certain complexities belong to higher study, which in practice means to no study at all, because by the time the student is old enough to receive the complexity, the moral architecture has already been poured around the simpler version. She revised the lesson once. She removed 2 surnames from the board. She replaced family names with initials. She placed more emphasis on invention, employment, bridges, schools, hospitals, the visible gifts that no one could deny. But the chart still worked. Even without the names, the dates gathered. Even without accusation, the sequence remained. There had been disruption, transfer, consolidation, sanctification. First the break, then the acquisition, then the institution, then the biography explaining why the institution was generous. The children understood the revised version even faster. That may have been what frightened the board. The lesson did not require secret testimony. It did not require a hidden archive, an intercepted letter, or a confession from a dying clerk. It only required placing public facts in an order that official memory had carefully avoided. Once arranged, the origin story of wealth stopped looking like a ladder climbed by exceptional men and began to resemble a series of doors opened during moments when others were locked out. By the second meeting, the word accuracy had disappeared. The word suitability had replaced it. The teacher was told that the lesson risked encouraging resentment toward established families. She answered quietly that resentment was not her subject. Origin was. That answer was entered nowhere in the minutes. That distinction mattered. After the second meeting, the lesson stopped belonging to the classroom. It entered the quieter machinery of permitted memory. A committee requested her materials. The headmaster asked for the ledger, the chart, the copied notices, the trustees, the city map with old parcels beneath new institutional names. He did not accuse her of error. He said the board wished to preserve them for review. They were not returned. The next approved syllabus arrived in cleaner language. Civic benefactors remained, but origins had been softened into temperament. One family possessed vision. Another showed public spirit. Another understood progress. Acquired became developed. Absorbed became expanded. Foreclosed became rescued. Consolidated became organized. Every sentence moved forward, away from the first transfer, the distressed title, the legal instrument by which one world had been converted into another. This was called modernization. That word did considerable work. It made removal sound like improvement and narrowing sound like clarity. It allowed the school to say it was preparing children for the future while reducing their access to the past. Genealogies were discouraged. Land origins became excessive detail. Foundation histories began with gifts, not acquisitions. Bank histories began with stability, not debt. Railway histories began with connection, not displacement. The teacher understood because she had already seen the same motion inside the records. First a disruption, then a transfer, then a new institution, then a story explaining why the institution had always belonged there. Now the school had repeated the sequence on memory. She continued teaching for one more year. In the official register, nothing unusual appears beside her name. Present, present, present. A note that her contract would not be renewed. No charge is recorded. No disciplinary hearing survives. No board member writes that she falsified a document. The record is smooth in the way institutional records become smooth after the important part has been handled elsewhere. Some of the children remembered fragments, a chart of names, a column of fires, a line drawn from a bank to a museum. the teacher's hand resting on the desk before she said, "Generosity was not a beginning." They remembered the quiet, because children recognize adult fear before they can explain its cause. Years later, one student wrote that the class had been told never to confuse gratitude with history. The sentence appears once in a private letter, then disappears into peripheral silence. Meanwhile, the families remained visible everywhere. Their names settled above reading rooms, laboratories, hospitals, concert halls, banks, insurance offices, railway terminals, university gates, municipal funds, and charitable boards. In public, they became proof of refinement. Their portraits watched over institutions that described them as builders. The origin question receded until asking it began to sound impolite, then ideological, then unserious. Philanthropy became the polished surface placed over acquisition, and eventually the surface was mistaken for the thing itself. I want to be precise. A donation can be real. A hospital can heal. A library can educate. A scholarship can change a life. None of that answers the earlier question. What was converted into the fortune before the fortune converted itself into public virtue? Whose land? Whose debt? Whose failed claim? Whose burned block? Whose unpaid labor? Whose vanished archive became the quiet foundation beneath the commemorative plaque? The schoolteacher did not solve that question. She only showed that it existed. That may be why the lesson had to be stopped so early, while it was still small enough to call unsuitable, before it became a method, before they learned to place every honored name beside the event that made its rise possible. Once that habit forms, official history changes shape. The benefactor is no longer removed from the collapse that preceded him. The institution is no longer innocent of the transfer that funded it. The city no longer appears built merely by vision, but by memory, disciplined after loss. The ledger is gone. The chart is gone. The board minutes preserve concern without substance. The textbooks carried forward the clean biographies, and the families continued appearing where children were taught to look up, not back. But the question survived the removal. It survives wherever a fortune begins, one sentence after a disaster. It survives wherever a family name appears first as creditor, then as trustee, then as donor. It survives in the strange politeness surrounding origins, in the preference for achievement over acquisition, in the classrooms where gratitude is still taught before sequence. She was told to stop saying where the richest families came from. What was never explained is why that sentence, if it was false, required silence instead of correction.